Hi everyone, welcome to Byte and Beyond with Uday. In this video, we will learn what is the difference between controller advice and race controller advice. We will understand this topic by doing a small practical example, and we will also understand what is the difference between Spring MVC flow and Spring REST API flow because this is related with this two concept, controller advice and race controller advice. So these both are related with the MVC flow and REST API flow. So let's begin. Our first point is to understand how Spring REST API flow works. So this is the diagram which I have prepared for you. REST flow is pretty simple. User calls controller, controller calls service calls repository. Repository talks with the database return the response, meaning it database returns the data, it comes to the repository and then it goes to the service and then controller and then user. So this is the REST controller basically. So that's how the REST API flow works. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. Now let's understand how Spring MVC flow works at a high level. So this is the diagram which I have prepared for Spring MVC flow. So this Spring MVC flow works slightly different than the REST API flow. So let's understand how exactly MVC flow works. So let's say user hit an API, let's say get employees. So it goes to controller. Okay, this is the simple controller, not a REST controller. Then controller talks with the model. So model is our service layer or the repository layer who basically prepare our data, okay, or prepare our response. So let's say in our case, um, controller calls the model basically fetches data from the database using the service and repository, whatever the implementation the application has. Then once model has the data from the database, this model returns that data to controller. Okay. Now, once the data is with the controller, controller will put that data in a container. Okay. In a container or a bag. Then controller will return a view name, not the actual data. Okay. The controller will return a view name. Let's say employee view page. Okay. For example, employee view.jsp. Then it goes to the this view layer, and view layer uh, convert that JSP page into the HTML page. Okay, but before the view converts that JSP page to HTML, the controller, as we know, after receiving data from the model, controller has put those data inside the container or a bag. So what will view do? View will fetch those data from the container or a bag, and it will map those data inside the JSP page, and then it will convert that JSP page to a HTML page. And in the end, HTML page will be sent to the browser, and the HTML page then will be get rendered for the user. Okay, so that's how the MVC flow works. Let me quickly summarize this flow so you understand it better. User hits the API, let's say employee, then it goes to the controller. Controller talks with the model talks with the database and return the response. Now controller has the response, all the data required. Okay. Now controller will put that data into the container or a bag. Okay. And controller will return a view name. For example, employee view.jsp. Then control comes to the view. Now view will fetch those data from the container. Okay, and fetch all these data from the container and put it into that JSP page, and then it will convert that JSP page to HTML page, and that HTML page will be sent to the browser. Okay, and browser will render that page for this user. So the flow will jump from view to here user. So that's how the Spring MVC flow works. Now let's jump into the practical. Okay, let's really understand the difference between controller advice and REST controller advice. Okay, so let me switch back to my IDE. You can see over here, I am already using REST controller advice. Okay, so in case of, let me switch back to this diagram. So if you have implemented REST API flow, in that case, you should use REST controller advice. Okay, so if I go inside this annotation, you can see the REST controller advice already contains other response body annotation. So this is needed in order to return a JSON response, or yeah, in REST API we usually return the JSON response. So for that we need this other response body annotation, because we are not returning any view name, right? We are returning a response directly to the user, not the view name. In case of MVC flow, as you know, we return a view name, not data. But here we return the actual data. That is why this at the rate response body is required. Okay. So if we just annotate our global exception handler with this annotation, REST controller advice, we are good to do. We are good to go. Okay. So let me just start this application and quickly demonstrate this REST controller advice behavior in case of error or something. Okay. So our application is up and running. So let's see. Okay. Let me try to fetch with user employee ID as 10. So you can see I'm getting exception over here. So that is perfect. Okay. And I don't need any response body or something over here, right? Even if I, okay, even if I, remove. So so in our case, this resource not found exception is getting hit. Okay, because you can see we are sending the HTTP status as 404 not found. So that's what we are seeing over here, 404. Even if I remove this response entity wrapper, we will still get the similar response. Okay, we don't require that other response body annotation. Why? Because this response, this REST controller advice itself contains this REST controller advice annotation. So we don't need to explicitly mention it somewhere else. Okay. So if we have seen over here earlier, our request, our this exception handler used to be like this response entity. Now I am directly returning this API error object. So now let's see how it goes or how it works. Our Spring Boot application is restarting. Okay, good. It is restarted, and see, we are getting the similar error, but you should see one difference. The actual difference is, you can see you are getting 200 okay, basically, 200 okay response over here. So which is not correct. We should see 404 over here instead of 200. Why we are getting 200? Because we have written, I mean, we have removed, actually, we have removed the response entity from here. Okay, so that is why the client or the browser or postman thinks that this is the valid response. That is why it is showing over here 200 okay. So even if we are, sending not found um, in our object, API error object, that is not sufficient because the postman or a browser is never going to read our response. It will read the data which we are, wrapping inside this response entity. Okay. So that is why you can see 200. Okay. So if there is no response available, it by default it shows 200. So let me undo my changes once again, and I will show you the difference. Okay. So now we should get the 404 over here. You can see now we can see 404 not found over here because we are sending the proper indication to the browser or the client. In our case, it is Postman, that hey, you should use the 404. You can see you should use this 404 not found status over here and over here. So that's what we are doing by declaring this HTTP status not found. Okay, now let's quickly switch back to the at the rate controller advice. So this controller advice is clear, right? This controller advice basically contains this response body, so we don't need to explicitly mention this annotation anywhere in our application. Now let's switch back to the controller advice. Okay, and let me do one thing. Let me restart my application. Our application is restarting, and it restarted successfully. Okay, let's move back to the Postman and let's hit this API. Let's see what happens. You can see, hey, this is the same response which we were getting even with the race control advice. But here is the catch. Here is the main difference that I am going to show you. So let me first explain why this works. Okay. Even with the controller advice. So the main reason is this response entity. So response entity do all the work for you. Okay. So this is the response entity. Okay. And this do all the job for you. And it basically, even if we are using at the rate controller device, still we are getting a proper response over here as well as proper HTTP status here as well. Okay. So this all magic is done by the response entity. Now let me remove this response entity from our method return type. Now what we are going to do is similar to REST controller advice, we are going to directly return this API error. And guess what? You can assume what is going to happen. You can guess. So I have restarted my application after doing these changes. So over here you can see we have removed the response entity from our method return type. Okay. So now let's hit the API once again. See, the API error response changed dramatically. Earlier, we used to get proper response with the error messages which we are sending from the server. But since we have removed this response entity from the method return type, now we are getting a generic server error message basically. Generic. This is a generic message. Okay, and by looking at this, I don't understand or I don't. exactly get what is wrong with my request. So this is a pretty simple request. So that is why we can say, yeah, I think employee is not found. Okay. But if there are some kind of complicated request, there are multiple entities or objects are involved in those cases, it is not clear. Okay. So this is just for the demonstration. So you get the idea. So right after removing that response entity from our method return type, and we have switched to the other controller advice, dramatically our response or error response is changed. Okay. So this is not what we need. We need a same error message across the application which we are sending from the server. So why this is happening? Okay. Because if you go inside this at the red controller advice, you will see there is no at the red response body annotation. Okay. And if you go inside this REST controller advice annotation, you can see over here we see this at the response body annotation. And in case of controller advice, we don't see. So this is the main difference. Now let me do one thing. So as I have removed that response entity because response entity was doing all the magic. Now let me do one thing. Let me explicitly mention this response body annotation over here. Now guess what? What will happen? Let's restart our application and figure it out. I will go with the option that it will give a proper error response, which we were getting, which is the intended error response. So let's see. Our application is restarted, and let's hit the API once again. See, we are getting the appropriate error message over here. Okay, you can see this is 200. Okay, but still, here is a mistake. Okay, we should receive the 404 over here, right? Not the 200. So this is still missing. Okay, so if you can see, the error response is correct, and this status is wrong. Okay, so let me check if we can fix this. Okay. Let me check what are the options we have inside this response body. No suggestion. Okay. Mm, okay. Uh, what I was thinking to, send some kind of status from here. Okay. Let me use one more annotation status. Okay. Response status. This should work. HTTP status not found. Okay. Let's see how it goes. Okay. This looks good to me. Um, so what we are doing? We are doing multiple things. Okay, by adding at the response body, we were getting this proper error response, but the status was wrong. Now let me do one thing. As you know, we have added this at the response status, and over here we are sending not found. So now we should see the proper uh, HTTP status over here as well. So we should see 404 instead of 200. So I have restarted our application. Let's see after it restarted successfully. Yeah, it's up and running. Now let's try the API. Success. See, now we are getting 404 not found. Okay. So Yeah, this is the quick difference between what I can say, controller advice and risk controller advice. And one more thing, I would like to tell you that, let's say, even in the risk controller advice, we were getting that 200 over here. But let me switch back to risk controller advice. Okay, and now we don't need this one at the response body. We need this only, response status. Okay, in order to get the 404. Yeah, our application is up and running. Now restart. I mean, hit the API. Now we see, even with the risk control advice, if we remove this response entity, so with the response status, we can see proper HTTP status over here. So now let me summarize everything for you. So race controller advice is useful, or it is recommended when you implement the REST API. So when the case is, you are always going to return JSON from your application. In that case, you should always use race controller advice. And along with the risk control advice, it is advisable that you should use this response entity. So you don't need to, add additional annotation at the response status or something over here in order to get a proper response. So if you can see, I have undo all these changes which we have made, and if I restart my application, so with the response entity, it do all the magic for you. So yeah, I have restarted, and it is up and running. See, even with the without response status, we are getting proper HTTP status as well as proper error response. So it is recommended if you are implementing REST APIs, which is always going to return a JSON. In that case, you should use REST controller advice, and along with this, you should use response entity. Inside the response entity, you should wrap your object. So you can send the appropriate status from the from your method itself. Okay. And in case if you are using Spring MVC application, your application is Spring MVC. So in that case, you should use controller advice. Okay. Why? Because as we understood from the diagram, okay, as we understood from the diagram, in MVC flow, this controller does not return a JSON to the user, but it returns the view name to the view, and then view renders all the data inside the HTML, and then HTML will display to the user. So the flow is bit different. So that is why use with the other controller advice. Okay. um Other control yeah, in the MVC flow, you should use other controller advice, because for example, let's say, for this handler. Okay. I mean, not this handler. For example, let's say controller advice. So I have mix of APIs. Few APIs return proper JSON. And for example, let me give you the example over here. Okay. um, let me give you a quick one. Let's say we have, let's take a resource not found itself. Okay. Now let's say instead of JSON response, I need to, um, I need to, yeah. Let's take a first simple example. Let's say other controller advice we use with the MVC flow. Now, now this handler should return a JSON. Okay. So in that case, you can use response entity, and if you are not using response entity, then you can use those at the response body and at the response status annotations. Okay, that is clear. Now let's assume as you are using MVC application, then in that case, let's say instead of this API error, you want to return a string from here. Okay, let's say error occurs in your application. Okay, and as you know, it will come over here. Now you want to return employee error 404, right? So what will this do? It will display a proper error page to the user. So when you are using MVC flow, okay, in that case you also, in some cases you also need to return this kind of string in order to display a proper HTML page, because as we know over here, as per the diagram, this controller returns a view name and then view will display to the user. So this is the view name basically. Okay, I can add some extension here as well, maybe JSP or HTML, anything, any valid extension which is supported by MVC. So yeah, that is why it is always recommended, if you are using, if your application is MVC, you can use other controller advice. Okay, whenever you want to return a page name, okay, you can return a page name from the handler. And in case you don't want to return a page name, you want to directly return a JSON response to the user. Okay, so in that case, you can use the response entity, or if you are not going to use response entity, you can use that at the race controller advice and at the response status annotation along with the at the controller advice, and you will be able to directly return the JSON response. So if we summarize in short, with MVC, use at the controller advice. With REST APIs, use REST controller advice. So this is the best practice. I hope you have understood the difference between these two annotation. I hope you have learned something meaningful today. And if you like my video, then please like, share, subscribe. So see you in the next video. Bye.